Welcome to the second half of our presentation. My name is Dr. Silgailis. I'm in charge of the Kinesiology Department. I was asked to moderate the panel, introduce. We have 4 student speakers who are going to react to some of the things that Dave said in his previous speech or bring up new issues. I'm supposed to mention he's not on his phone. He is taking notes. I said it's going to look like they're sitting in class and someone's on their phone the whole class. They take away their phones, but he's processing the information because I think what we decided to do is I'm going to introduce each student. They are going to speak for a few minutes and then he's going to react to whatever he wants to react to that's brought up by the students. So we're going to start with Brian Arvidson, who is actually a student of mine in the Kinesiology Department. He's an exercise science major. He was just named the award winner for our department, the Exercise Physiology Award, for having the highest, I don't know if I can say this, he'll be embarrassed, the highest GPA of the exercise science graduating seniors. We are very proud of him. He is also treasurer of the Paterson Kinesiology Club, and he is doing his internship, and he works how many hours a week, and he is going to present. He's also in my class, which is talking about these issues, so he's well versed on these issues, and he's going to make a few comments, and then we'll go to the next student.
Okay. Well, first thing I want to say is did a great job with your speech. I actually came in sort of preparing to spar with you because I didn't think that sports were really a medium for social change. But some of the examples you brought up point to excellent points in history where change has been made by people making a stand. My previous feeling was that sports is just sort of a mirror of society, and we need to make the changes in society as opposed to sports figures standing out. One of the things you had mentioned during your talk was feeling that the college system needs to change. I noticed you had said that. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on what you would do about that. And also your feelings on, there was a report in USA Today, I think it was last year, about the profitability of particularly football at the college level. And it turns out that out of 225 schools, there's only about 16 that really turn a profit. And any comments on the impact of that to the rest of the academics?
Okay, Kareem McKenzie is a student in the Master of Education Professional Counseling Program here at William Paterson, former member of the New York Jets and New York Giants, and is 2-time Super Bowl champion for the
Not with the Jets.
Giants. How do you play for both?
Well, I started with the Jets, played there for 4 years, and played for the Giants for 7 years. You know, I think one of the most interesting things that Dave brought up is, the history of social justice and the way in which differing athletes have played a part in the civil rights movement and also the social justice arena. I remember years ago, I read a book by Bill Rhoden, a writer from the New York Times, called The $40 Million Slave, and I thought it very interesting that the prominent figures that we have in sports who have the ability to speak out against social injustice or racism don't do so. And the most recent event with Richie Incognito, I found very appalling, and being a member of an alumnus of the NFL, I found it to be very caustic, the way in which the NFL was dealing with that issue, and a lot of the telltale signs I thought were there that just really gave onus to the fact that we're not as far as we think we are in terms of sports, and there are still some issues that need to be addressed in terms of what's going on in the sports world.
Okay, next up, Sheena Maldonado, who is a criminology and criminal justice major with a minor in legal studies. She has served in the U.S. Army for the past 2 years. Sheena?
The question that I have towards you, you brought up about Jason Collins and Michael Sams, and they have a lot of coverage because of them coming out and of them in the sports league. But I wonder why that Brittany Griner, who was #1 pick for the drafts, didn't have as much coverage. I feel like it was just like she said, oh, I'm coming out, and the media was just like, okay, you like the same sex, but how about them Giants? Or they just kind of passed it along the rug, like under the rug. Why is that the males that are gay, they get more coverage than a female who's came out and is a lesbian?
Like sitting down. Last up, Annalis Mitcho, who is a double major in psychology and women's and gender study, member of the William Paterson women's field hockey team. She's also a student representative for the HERO campaign, promoting the importance of designated drivers.
I just wanted to start off by saying I had no knowledge about Muhammad Ali and all of the things that he did and the people he inspired, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King. So that was really interesting to find out about that. And then I actually wrote down the quote that you said about Jackie Robinson, that people said that he was tarnishing his own legacy, mixing policy and sports. And I really can't think of a better example of that than Michael Sam and how all the sportscasters were saying, think about what this is going to do to his potential draft pick and things like that. So I guess just what I would like to elaborate on is why is his legacy being tarnished when we have the other people in the NFL, I'm an Eagles fan, so Riley Cooper, what he did, at the concert, the language he used, I guess, maybe thinking back to Kobe Bryant and the rape allegations way back when. So just, why aren't their legacies really being tarnished? And Michael Sam's, his legacy's questioned, so.
Wow, those are just some lighthearted questions for everybody today. Well, first, I think as a starting point to frame this whole discussion is to be very, take what your Jackie Robinson point as a start, is like when people say sports and politics don't mix or sports and politics shouldn't mix, let's be very precise about what they mean by that. They mean sports and a certain kind of politics should not mix, not politics in general. Because when it comes to the politics, and it is politics, of excusing racial slurs by Riley Cooper, not sanctioned, not suspended or whatnot. When it comes to the politics of how quickly Kobe Bryant was embraced and re-embraced in the NBA, when it comes to the politics of, and this is, once again, I want to be clear, this is not a value judgment, but just this is politics. When it comes to the politics of militarism at NFL games, of flying warplanes overhead, of unspooling the flag beforehand, of the NFL's salute to service, which salutes military families. Once again, I am not, particularly because of a member of the armed forces here, I am not saying that that's being bad or good, but I'm saying we have to recognize that these constitute politics. But it's a certain kind of politics that they don't want. And you see how complicated and how intricate it can get with the Michael Sam and Jason Collins example, because clearly the sports leagues recognize that it is a deficit from a business perspective in 2014 to look like homophobic Neanderthals. So they are figuring out, how do we look like we embrace diversity and we embrace different sexuality in our league, while at the same time making sure that the league is not a political engine for LGBT rights at the same time. And you heard this in the press conferences of both Michael Sam and Jason Collins, both of whom I've met before, both of whom are incredibly intelligent, and both of whom said very similar things, which was basically, I'm not here to be a trailblazer. I'm just here to play. I'm just here to play basketball, or I'm just here to play football. And it's like, it's that almost like a Gary Cooper American ethos with a rainbow flag on it. You know what I'm saying? It's like that same kind of like, I'm just here to play. Michael Sam even had this comment where he said, like he was asked about the Missouri community embracing him, and he said, I'd cry, but I'm a football player. That same like real men don't cry kind of thing. So it's like not consciously not breaking what's expected of a man, even if it's now a gay man and not a straight man. And that's so much a part of sports. Now this connects directly to the Brittany Griner question. Because let's be very frank, why wasn't Brittany Griner as big a story? One, because there's a stereotype that women's sports is filled with lesbians, so what's one more? That's very straight up. Two, because she was not the first, just like the next male player who comes out will not be, unless it's like Kobe Bryant, will not be nearly as big a story as Jason Collins. And three, because Brittany Griner was someone herself who, as she put it, she wasn't coming out because she was never in. So it's not, in other words, it wasn't like people were like, oh my God, Brittany Griner's gay. You know, it's like, it was not something that defied people's stereotypes of what it means to be gay or what it means to be straight. And a lot of those stereotypes are still very antediluvian, prehistoric, old thinking in terms of sports. A gay man looks this way, a gay woman looks this way. And there's still these very fixed ideas in sports. And so someone like Michael Sam, who's 6'4", 260, sacks the quarterback, he violates the expectation of what a gay man is supposed to be, while Brittany Griner, less so. This is not a good thing. This is not something I'm endorsing at all, but it's the reality about how the media conceives of this. Now, unfortunately, the problem with it, so I just laid out what I think are facts. Now, let me put a critique on that, an opinion, is that the problem with that is that it all rests on the assumption that it's somehow easier for women to come out. It's easier to be a gay female athlete. And all my experiences interviewing female athletes say that that's just absolutely not the case. As Kate Fagan puts it, she writes for ESPN, she played at Colorado, she's a gay woman, she said, it's not that it's easier or less easy, it's that it's different. Different challenges, different stereotypes, different expectations, different struggles. And you got to read Kate Fagan. She has a book coming out called Disappearing Acts that goes through this in great detail. I strongly recommend it. So that's how I would answer the Brittany Griner question. Yeah, I said I was taking notes, but then I got into what other people were saying, and I didn't. I will. It's an honor to be up here with Mr. McKenzie here, absolutely, because it's always because to me it's like even being an athlete or even a former athlete who wrestles with ideas, who gets on a stage with a microphone, even in our society. I mean that's transgressive, and it's always terrific to see. And I think that the book $40 Million Slaves is something that everybody should read by Bill Rhoden. So I second that very strongly. One of the points that Bill Rhoden makes, which I think is so important, is it's like if the African-American athlete in the 21st century makes so much more money than the folks in the 1960s who were parts of movements, who represented movements. So the ceiling is so much higher in terms of what an African-American athlete can be. For example, it's not a story if the Eagles have a black quarterback, like it was even when Donovan McNabb was drafted in '99. So it's like there has been progress, there has been change. The ceiling is much higher. That being said, the floor is much lower. I mean, when you look at issues like the prison population in this country, what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, the pitfalls. I can tell you this just from my wife teaching in DC public schools. I went to public schools in New York. If you got in a fight, you went to the principal's office. Today, if you get in a fight, mandatory rule, you have to call the police and they fill out a report. Kid gets a record when they're 15, 16 years old. I mean, so the floor is so much lower. And one thing that Bill Rhoden believes that I think is manifestly true is that, like the Miami Heat did in terms of talking about Trayvon Martin, which is connected to this, is I think the civil rights movement of our time has to do with reforming the criminal justice system in this country, and that athletes have a role to play in speaking about that. And one thing that I have found is that that's the easiest issue. When you're talking about getting athletes to be political, it's the toughest thing to get a pro athlete to talk about is something like stadium construction, which is not fair, but they see it as their money too, because it means more league revenues. The easiest thing to get a lot of pro athletes to talk about is criminal justice and the prisons, because a lot of them have family or friends who are behind bars, and so it's a real part of their lives. So here they are living in this kind of rarefied existence that we're taught to admire, and they have dear friends who live in a 6x8 cell. So it's so just to point that out, and then the last thing is just about the NCAA, and the easy answer for how to do the NCAA differently would be to just say, that's way above my pay grade, but because it is very complicated. Like, what the heck do you do? You have revenue-producing sports and non-revenue-producing sports. Do all student athletes get money or some sort of stipend, or just the ones who bring in positive revenue into a school? How does that affect recruiting? Can schools compete against each other? Like, you'll get more for going to Alabama than Colorado. And how does that affect things? There are all kinds of questions that immediately get raised when you start talking about this that really don't have easy answers. The one thing that I'm completely sure about, though, is that the status quo cannot hold at all, and that athletes themselves, the student athletes, need to have a seat at the table in terms of discussing what this is going to look like going forward. And at the very least, you would think that the scholarship could be guaranteed for 4 years and that medical treatment could be guaranteed if they get hurt in the field. So you can start with some basic points of agreement that would make the system far more just than it is now. Can I ask Kareem a question? Just because I'm honestly
Sure.
curious. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
I'm just curious about your own journey. Like you get done with the National Football League. You're a known figure. A lot of people in your position would try to get maybe a radio show or something like that, or find something, or maybe work in the league itself. And you chose to go back to school here. Why did you choose to go back to school, and why do you choose to study what you're studying?
Well, one of the main things, the main reasons why, eventually I would like to work for the NFL and work in the NFL, but through my own journey of retiring and going through that whole process of trying to decide, how to transform my life into life after football, I had to read a lot of different books about depression and other things that I was going through in terms of retirement and how to grapple with my diminished capacity in terms of relevance in terms of sports. And through that journey and being able to read a lot of different books, I found that there was a correlation between retired athletes and retired service members of our armed services, and realizing that and looking at the different issues we dealt with in terms of codependency on our relevance, in terms of what we do and the importance of it, and the cohort in which we exist. We're used to being in large numbers in groups of people, and to no longer have that sense of camaraderie with my former teammates. How do I deal with that? And so I said, looking at it from the standpoint of how can I best serve my fellow players, because a lot of other players who have retired also, as I talked about before this panel, is that a lot of people don't know that statistically the average NFL career is only 3 years long, and I played for 11 years, so I go against the grain to a certain extent. And of those people that actually do retire from the NFL, 5 years removed from their existence in the NFL and retirement, over 75% of athletes are financially unstable, divorced, or suicidal. And that proportion, that percentage jumps up to 90% when you're talking about African Americans and other ethnicities that are in the majority of the sport. So, realizing that I wanted to do something to help my fellow players, and also to try and reach down into the high school ranks and the college ranks to help these individuals and players understand that, it's a very tough journey to get to the NFL and or these other respective professional sports, but it's even more difficult to get out of that lifestyle, to remove yourself from the everyday hustle and bustle of it, because we get so involved with, in terms of winning and losing, that we forget about life in and of itself. And I don't like to think of myself as a retired football player, because before I ever played the sport of football, I was a son, a cousin, a brother. I had many different hats that I had to wear. It's just that I was blessed with the opportunity to play a sport and to get out of it healthy and to have all my mental faculties about myself. So that's how I came to decide to be a professional counselor, to go ahead and help other players and other people understand life outside the cusp of, from an esoteric viewpoint, what you are in terms of life as a whole, and not just within that respective sport.
I'll just say I hope you do some large group speaking and not just one-on-one counseling, I will say. Any other questions from, any follow-ups based on anything I said or Kareem said, or any questions from folks here? We could do it any way you guys
Just
want.
a comment or a question on what Kareem said about counseling at the high school level and at, I don't know if you're counseling at like Pop Warner level or whatever. Right. Have you tried to make any strides, or do you see a way to make any strides to change the culture of masculinity that is seemingly violent? You have to hide your pain. You have to, denigrate others to get ahead. Is there Is there a possibility that you can assist with that, or is there any way that either you or David see a way to change that?
You can definitely change the scope of the way in which we try to supposedly invigorate our players. And it's all about motivation. And one of the main things that I always found very interesting is that in terms of coaches that rely upon the way in which they grew up in a sport versus how they've gotten to their current level of status, whether it be professional or the high school level. And the main thing that really I think people forgot about is the Rutgers situation that happened a little over a year ago, in which you have a college basketball coach who was out there denigrating his players and throwing basketballs at them. And I'm trying to think to myself, if I were a player in that situation, what are some of the factors that might allow me to be denigrated, to be talked to derogatorily, and what would I do as a person, as an individual, myself? And within the realm of football, in terms of when I grew up playing football, that wouldn't take place because, number one, it's football. It's a manly sport, but you have to understand and realize that within that sport, if people are actually hurt, they're hurt. If they're injured, they're injured. And the difference is the state of mind. Because at any one point in time, you have to realize that as a player in any sport or participating in any team sport, you have the power of choice. And it's just as simple. I mean, as much as it may hurt you to walk away from a scholarship, and even in terms of the professional ranks of the whole situation with Richie Incognito, that to me was just so awkward because the NFL makes a point of ensuring that every individual player knows that there is a player development director there within the team to help you transition or with any lifestyle problems that you may have, because you are the product. You are the product as a player in the NFL, and if you're unhappy, then you can't perform on the field. And that's another thing that also made me want to go into professional counseling is that I have seen too many fellow teammates go to a funeral on a Saturday and play a game on a Sunday. How can you possibly grieve and respect the loss of a loved one and the next day play a game? That was one of the main things that I was so upset, and I was glad that I was not involved with the NFL when the whole Javon Belcher situation transpired. Because there's no way in the world you can convince me, I don't care how many times they want to say it, you cannot convince me that those players on the Kansas City Chiefs wanted to play a football game the day after their fellow teammate blew his brains out in the parking lot of that stadium. I can't believe that. There's no way you can get me to agree with that. I don't care what you say about it. That in no way, shape, or form, in my opinion, and this is solely my opinion, serves the memory of an individual. This is a teammate. This is a man who went ahead and killed his girlfriend and took away the parents of his newborn child. That's a sad situation that, how can anybody come to grips with that and then the next day say, I'm going to play this in memory of you? That person went through a lot of pain, a lot of turmoil, and to make a decision to take his own life along with that of his daughter's mother, and to rob that child of the ability to grow up with two loving parents, is a shame.
Yeah, I wrote about that at the time. I was just appalled that the team went forward with that game. I want to read a quote if I could. I was looking it up while Kareem was talking. Let me read the quote first. A little boy falls down, and the first thing we say as parents is, get up, shake it off, you will be okay, don't cry. When a little girl falls down, what do we say? It's going to be okay. We validate their feelings. So right there from that moment, we are teaching our men to mask their feelings and not show their emotions. It's that times 100 with football players. You can't show that you're hurt, you can't show any pain. So for a guy that comes into the locker room and he shows a little vulnerability, that's a problem. So that's what I mean by the culture of the NFL, and that's what we have to change. That was said by Brandon Marshall, Pro Bowl wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. And I read that just to say that everything we're talking about is an active conversation in the National Football League. We should not look at it as a static environment or a static culture. That there are a lot of players, particularly in this era of concussion awareness, who realize that it's not just about being a tough guy and playing with a bruised hip anymore. It's about whether or not you're going to be able to know the names of your children when you're 50 years old. And a lot of players are really reckoning with what we mean by manhood and how we define manhood. And what made the Jonathan Martin, Richie Incognito saga so interesting is that you had different NFL players publicly fall on different sides. And it really became a discussion of how do we, like, to me, I described it as manhood versus humanhood, because the manhood is saying that if you're the toughest, the meanest, the most vulgar, the most misogynistic, then you're king. But what kind of humanity, what kind of courage does it take to blow the whistle on something like that? And that's what Jonathan Martin did. And so that's what we have in front of us. And one of the things that, like, all my writing, when I try to put forward, is that these aren't just football questions. Because even if you have kids who don't play football, it shapes our culture. It shapes how we speak to our own children. It shapes the kind of discussions he had. Like what Brandon Marshall's talking about is not an NFL field. He's talking about you have kids and they fall down, and what do you say? And do you validate their feelings, or do you tell them to shake it off? And I'm sure, as Ms. Maldonado could tell us, that there's reflections of this in the armed forces as well.
Oh, you want me to speak about it?
If you want to. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot, but I just
I guess,
imagine there is.
From coming from a military background, like my father and my brother, I never thought I would be in it because it's more seen as a male-dominant career. You don't, even now, the military doesn't allow you to do certain jobs. There's only male-only jobs, infantry. All the combat jobs, frontline jobs, no females are allowed to do it. They're now changing that. Females can now be engineers. It's not front of the line, it's not combat, but they're changing it. So I guess like that's a big thing about the military. And we also, even with physical fitness tests, there's different standards for females and males. Yeah, we're in the same job, doing the same thing, but I guess they feel that the females don't have the same ability to run as fast as the males do, or to do as many push-ups as the males do, or the only thing that's the same is the sit-ups. We all have the same amount of sit-ups to do, but as far as push-ups and run time, it's a huge difference. Males have to run in about a 2 mile and a 14. Females have up to 18 minutes to run. So that's a huge difference in just running. As far as push-ups, females have to do only 18 while males have to do 52. That's another big difference. While females can do as high as males can do for physical fitness testing.
We take questions from out
Well,
here.
well, first I would say if you had any other comments as well, because everybody else got to speak twice.
I was just going to say, as a women and gender studies major, we do a lot of studying kind of how children are raised and the environments in which they're raised, and the structurally constructed gender roles, that they're placed in from birth. Boy gets the blue blanket, girl gets the pink blanket when they're born, and then just the boys don't cry. It's just, it's all relevant, and then it stretches in areas outside of sports, in politics and, all different types of areas. So, I just like to comment on how it's not, it's not just football. It's how, it's shaping the world, really.
And that gets to, I'm sorry, what's your name, sir? I forget. Brian. I think something Brian said at the beginning that you just reminded me that I wanted to get back to. It's that I first and foremost, starting point of sports is that it's a reflection of society. So I thought, your starting point was absolutely correct in terms of going in. Isn't it just a reflection? Absolutely. And that's true of every single society that's ever existed that's had sports. And that's been every society. I mean, as soon as human beings could clothe and feed themselves, they organized games to play. So every society, the sports reflects that given society. But then what's so interesting about culture, particularly mass culture in the 21st century, is that it then ricochets and then shapes what it was reflecting, to the point of which where you don't know where the reflection begins or ends. And particularly when you talk about the ways in which sports has become a big business. We're talking about whether it's stadium construction or whether we're talking about, when we talk about the NCAA, one of the things we didn't discuss is the way in which in the 21st century, in a lot of small towns, the college is the economic engine of the entire region. And the football program is like the engine of the engine. That was a failed metaphor, but you get my point. So it's like, a place like Notre Dame, it's an extra $1 million into South Bend, Indiana's economy every time the Notre Dame football team wins. Or a place like Happy Valley, where Penn State is. It's like the ability of Penn State to have a successful football team. What it does is it brings people to an area where otherwise they would not go. And often, in a lot of these places, these are former industrial places. South Bend, Indiana, which used to be a textile town, where there just happened to be this small Catholic college called Notre Dame. There's no more textiles, but there's Notre Dame. And so the pressure to make sure that the football team is protected and cloistered and defended at all costs has huge, not just economic, but psychological, cultural, and social ramifications. And there are a few cases where this was more tragic, where there's the story, I wrote about it a great deal, and it's not a fun thing to talk about, but it's the young woman Lizzie Seberg who went to the nearby school of Notre Dame, and she took her own life after she was sexually assaulted by a football player. And one of the last things she did with her friends before she took her own life was going to a Notre Dame game to cheer on the person who had assaulted her with the Notre Dame logo stenciled on each side of her face. And she came from a family where 3 generations of people had gone to Notre Dame. And she's getting text messages from other people on the football team about, if you speak about this, you're going to get in trouble. All of this thing where, and the default position of coach, community, team is you defend the team at all costs. And that's an extreme example, but it's a very real example. Or the fact, it's like, the important thing is, like, even in cases where we don't know what happened, even what we know says that sports plays way too essential role in these towns. Like at Florida State, Jameis Winston, people may know, the Heisman winning quarterback, was accused of rape. We don't know if he was guilty or innocent. We were not there. But what we do know is that the woman who wanted to come forward was told by the police, you better not do this. This is a big Seminole town. So that we do know. And it says a great deal about the ways in which institutionally players are protected. And the reasons are not just because the police department are big fans of the team. It's because there is such economic, social, and cultural weight in these small towns for the football program.
The panelists are doing a great job. I could learn a lot from you if you were my professor, but maybe I'm a little older than you in terms of professorialships too. The panelists are almost a different generation, and a thought process comes with different generations. I'd like to ask the panelists if you would comment first, and maybe Dave, you could respond to what they say to this question. A few years ago, I was teaching statistics. I teach in the kinesiology department, and we wanted to figure out the problem of what the fastest time will ever be in history. And if you look at the 100-meter times, it's come down drastically. It's almost parabolic. It comes down in a curved, linear way. We learn from history, and that's what we are today. But I'd like to know from the panelists, let's project 100 years from now. What social justice issue will not exist then that exists now?
In sports or in general?
Oh, in sports. I'm specifically talking about, homophobia or sexism, racism. Where are we going to be if we learn from history? What are we learning? Where's the future? And the young people should tell me, because I'd like to know, because I won't be here.
Well, I think what you'll see mainly is that there will be a lesser stigmatization in terms of sports, because what we're seeing now in terms of football, in terms of the concussive studies and the concussive events and the research that is coming out, we're seeing a lot more in terms of players being able to recognize the effects, and looking at some of the older players who have gone before us that, they're making a conscious decision. Is it really worth my later sense of health and well-being to play this sport in the violent manner in which it's played? Because of the advantages of science and technology, the equipment that we're now wearing is a lot lighter than it used to be. So it used to be, years ago when I first started playing, when I put on my helmet, my pads and everything else, it's 25 pounds worth of equipment. Whereas my last few years, I got a little bit more smarter, so to speak, smarter. And I took some of the padding out, I put in a different type of pad. It got down to 15, maybe 10 pounds. So I could move faster, a little bit older. So of course I want to be able to maintain my same sense of speed. But I had more concussions and more events that weren't necessarily concussive, but I was hitting people harder and they were hitting me harder, and I was, seeing stars a little bit. So I think you're going to see in the future that there's going to be more dependence on sports in terms of a driver, in terms of making it out of the hood or your neighborhood, so to speak, and more so dependence on the outlying technologies and the ability to use your head more so than just your athletic ability.
I'm not sure how that's social justice or what we're talking about, but I'll add one more to that. 100 years from now, they're going to have helmets that are going to detect things. It's a medical matter right now. So if we stick on the topic of what we have now, 100 years from now, I don't think you're thinking big enough. So anybody else too, and I don't want to speak on you because you got the idea, medical will change. We will not be covered by the current medical system that we have now, my projection.
Right.
So I think that's a social justice issue. People are afraid to go to the hospital, when they're older because maybe you have some conditions right now that maybe you are or are not covered by your medical coverage. I don't know. I think medical coverage is going to change.
Well, to speak to that, to better clarify, I think from a socioeconomic standpoint, you won't see as many players dependent upon the NFL or these sports, and sort of like what Bill Roden spoke to in terms of $40 million save. I think you're going to see more social activism in terms of what players are able to do and speak out against, and because of what we're now seeing in terms of concussive studies saying, you know what, I want to grow up to be like you. And then, whenever I would hear younger players say that, I would always tell them, if you're going to grow up to be like me, you're not really paying attention, because I'm telling you and I'm showing you the ways of how to do things and not what to do. Learn from my mistakes. And if you can do that, you'll be a more successful player. And number one, first and foremost, you won't stay in the sport longer than you should have in the first place, which a lot of players in the past have done. Because they're dependent upon that paycheck. They're dependent upon going ahead and being, socially correct in terms of not being able to speak out against things because they know if they speak out against this, well, they won't make as much money. Or because they see a social wrong, they won't be able to speak up because of, well, it may hurt my ability to get another contract with this team. Because there are certain things that happen in the locker room, like the whole Richie Incognito situation, that I'm glad that Jonathan Martin stood up and said something, because no one should go through that type of treatment in any environment. And for some players to come out and to side on both sides of the fence really surprised me, because in my opinion, the use of the N-word, I don't care in what context, is not okay. And just because you feel as though, and I made this example that I don't care if Richie Incognito grew up in an all-black town, was raised by an all-black family, and was, there's no extent to which I can go ahead and say that he is a part of my race, because he's not going through the struggles. He's not looked at in the same vein that I am, just from a purely, just a visual standpoint. And there's no way in shape or form he can know and understand how bad that word hurts, because he's never been a part of the race itself.
In terms of social justice, this might be from my optimistic point of view, but I would love, for the day, 100 years from now, I do think that homophobia will, no longer be something where it deserves it won't be deserving of a top news story on SportsCenter for, a week straight or however long it was. So I guess that would be mine.
I actually had the same thing about homophobia, that after players now that are coming up, either high school or going into college, that want to go pro, they're going to see that Jason Collins and Michael Sams and any other people, they've came out and they were, I guess, were the founders of it. They started this, I'm going to come out and be in a pro sport, and it's going to make it easier for other, people that are having troubles with their sexuality, whether they're gay, lesbian, bi, trans, and it's going to make it easier for them. And sports 100 years from now, it's going to be more accepted. There's going to be more homosexualities. Coaches are going to be okay with it, and it's not going to really be looked at like, oh, you're gay. I don't really want, I have a problem with this. So I believe this is just the beginning, and they got a long way to go, but 100 years will be definitely more accepted, even with the marriages being accepted now in more states. If we're going, now all of the states are accepting gay marriage. Down the line, they're definitely gonna, I hope almost all the states are gonna be, homo-friendly or gay-friendly, and they're gonna allow people that, have the same sex want to marry each other. So that's definitely gonna play a part for sports as well.
And maybe this is optimistic on my part too, but I would hope that we actually hit a point of, true racial equality inside sports. Because as we talked about before, the leagues are, there's a large number of African-American athletes inside a league, but there's not a lot of owners. There's not a lot of head coaches. David mentioned the point about referees inside the league. It seems like athletes can get to a certain point where they can participate in it, but they're not allowed to steer how the sport goes. And I think that needs to end. I mean, we need to get beyond that point, and there should be true racial equality inside sports. And I would hope within 100 years we're to that point. In my opinion, it's overdue.
Well, I don't want to sound, I'm about to sound both very optimistic and very pessimistic, because part of this, for me, the starting point of what it's going to look like in 100 years is what's this world going to look like in 100 years. And I think as a world, it might not be in my lifetime, but I do think it'll be in my kids' or my grandkids' lifetime. We're looking at either a much more sane way of living as a human species, or we're looking at kind of abject barbarism. And sports will reflect that. There will be sports whether we live in a more humane way or whether we live in a more barbaric way. And if we're living in a more barbaric way, then I hope people enjoyed the Hunger Games, because that's what our sports are going to be like. And it's going to be life and death, insanity, gladiatorial, people finding the most bloodthirsty ways to escape lives that are defined by subsistence, basically, in a world that's in very bad ecological shape. But I don't think that's necessarily so. I think there's also a chance that people will organize themselves and say, well, wait a minute, there's enough resources on this planet that we can live well. We need to figure out a way to deal with those resources in a way that doesn't hurt the planet. And I think if human beings can get together and figure that out, then I think sports will reflect that. And one of the ways sports will reflect that will not only be what my co-panelists have said here today, which is this idea that there won't be these stigmas attached to you if you want to play sports, that women, if you're LGBT, it's like the you can play. I think the game is there for you to play. But I also think in a more sane world, what you'll also see is the breakdown of the barrier between, and this will be incredibly progressive, but the breakdown of the barrier between participant and watcher, because we really are a nation of watchers, and sports are to be played. And I think it would be, most people don't play sports because they're tired and they got other stuff to do. So the idea of creating more time so people can play and be part of everything that Kareem said, because, I was getting a little misty-eyed when Kareem was talking about playing in the NFL and talked about being among large groups of people and having that sense of community, because, that's something I haven't had since I played in high school, and there's a part of me that still misses it. And this idea that it has to be something that we give up is a tragedy to me. It's like it should be something that's a part of our lives: fellowship, play, athletics, health. But that'll take us actually, really fighting to have that kind of space.
So do you counsel now, or are you planning to counsel?
I'm planning to counsel. I'm currently in my first year of the program, and I have a good 6 years before I'm done. And I'm trying to actively work with the NFL player development department to, develop some programs and some different initiatives and ways to, really narrow down the focus and, help these players, what I say, actively transition, because a lot of times, the main portion of what the NFL does now is to focus on the incoming players, which is what they have a rookie symposium. But my idea is that, we need to go ahead and pay attention to those players that are going through years 5 through 7, that have gone through that rookie transition, that have, acclimated to the NFL life, and now need to know what to do in terms of preparation for life after football.
Okay, because I did my grad program on male athletes and career transition. Mm-hmm. And so that's my big focus. And I talked about identity foreclosure in terms of once you leave the realm of sports, how do you, just like I'm out of the military, how do you become a civilian?
Right.
Okay, my brother, he believes in, because a lot of things like, he believes in being attacked, so we do this together. Mm-hmm. Everybody's a group.
Right.
And so when I decided to come to California, when I decided to come out here, just broke the whole nucleus. It's just me and the family, and oh my God, but it is mindful. I have to remember, I can't be mad at it because that's what he's used to, being a part of a pack.
Right.
And the fact that the NFL, NCAA doesn't look at it in terms of PTSD, is that being the same thing when you exit out of the realm of sports, as that being similar, it just boggles me.
Right.
Because it goes hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Definitely.
But I really commend you for wanting to look at that population, because that's something I think goes under the radar in terms of the adverse effects it has on these individuals later on in life.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the main things that, the NFL doesn't realize is that you have, and that was the main corpus of the argument, a couple of years ago when they had that lockout, was, it was a bunch of billionaires versus millionaires, and you have people who are in the seat, the ownership seats, who haven't played the sport, who don't realize what it's like to put on that helmet, to put on those pads, and to actively go out there and to run at somebody as fast as you can, and basically be a barbarian on the field. And that's one of the main things that I think that, we need to come to realize is that when you talk about an NFL player as an individual, you have to look at what they're asked to do. You're asking that individual for 4 hours on a Sunday to be an absolute animal, beast, and throw caution to the wind, and all of a sudden to stop that after a game is over. I mean, there has to be a delineation of, a calm down period where you need to leave me alone for a couple hours so that I can go ahead and allow myself to de-escalate and come back down to an even keel, because I mean, even to this day, playing around with my nieces and nephews, if someone hits me the wrong way, I react the way I would on a football field, because that's what my body is used to. So, I mean, it's something that you have to be very cognizant of and realize that I need to be able to adjust and separate my life and compartmentalize it in terms of being able to do things outside of football in my career, that I don't lose focus of who I am as a person. Because one of the main things that just really saddened me was to hear about Junior Seau committing suicide. That's a player, that's someone that I played against numerous times, and he played the game for 19 years. And when you think about that, 19 years is a long time to have invested in terms of your identity as a player, and to walk away from that all of a sudden and to be a nobody can be very devastating.
Now, do they have therapists in the NFL that helps with individuals coming out with professional football help?
In turn,
the word they're about to enter after?
Well, they have a program that you can be a part of that I actually didn't seek out myself, because I was in the process of my own transformation and really trying to figure out what it is I wanted to do, because I still was hanging on for a year and a half later. I still might play football, and I had to eventually hang that up, because it came a point where I said, they basically sent me a check saying, okay, thank you for your involvement in the NFL. And I was like, oh, so it is over. Because I never actually signed retirement papers. I never actually officially retired. I just never was re-signed.
Would you have liked for that to be introduced to you? This is something we can offer you as an extension after.
I think that in order to be effectively counseled leaving the NFL, you need to be in it during your time there to deal with the issues that you have, because that's I've seen numerous players have complete meltdowns on game day and not be able to function because of some other auxiliary problem they may be having in their home life, and they can't function. So, I mean, it's something that needs to start and happen throughout your whole career, and not just when you walk away from it. Because the coping mechanisms that we have in terms of how we deal with issues, when we rely upon them, they tell you, as soon as you cross that white line, it's all football. Well, it's not all football, because it's still in the back of your mind. It's going to play in your mind, and you may be able to go ahead and avoid your issues or problems for 4 hours, but when you come back home, that issue's still right there facing you in the face.
That's exactly what I tell my students when I advise on this and taking the test. They have to realize they have outside factors that may affect, so make sure they work through all of that.
Definitely.
You're correct.
So we're talking a lot about NCAA during your lecture, and I want to say, this is Dr. Kareem, what level of exploitation did you feel as a paid athlete rather than just a student athlete in the NFL? Did you ever feel exploited? And this one's directed towards Dave. As fans, what can we do to not be exploited as fans compared to ownership, as in terms of new buildings, ticket prices rising, and things like that?
Well, I think one of the main things as an NCAA athlete, being exploited, you knew you were, because there were times that I can remember definitively that we were only allowed to get, I think it was like maybe $40 a month in terms of our allotment. And you had to, as a student, figure out ways to make that $40 last, because there's no way to get any more money. And I grew up in a single parent home, so I couldn't call back home and get more money. So there were days that I would actually starve myself to a certain extent to make this money last, in case I wanted to go ahead and go out or maybe go to a movie and do something else. And one of the things where I also realized I was exploited is that I had actually won a post-grad scholarship, and they sent me a letter letting me know that I won the scholarship and that they were thanking me for contributing towards my current scholarship. So I'm like, wait a minute, so I won an award and I don't even get it? Like, how does that transpire, because Dave touched on it earlier, your scholarship is renewed every year, but your scholarship isn't even paid for by the university. It's paid for by the football booster club or whoever else supports the football team, and the university doesn't even go ahead and contribute towards your actual scholarship. And then one of the main things that really upset me, and I didn't find out until years later while I was in the program at Penn State, is that they actually counted the money that we were awarded in terms of bowl games towards the university budget. So if we didn't make it to a bowl game, that was a deficit. They had to cut some programs here or there. So they were dependent upon that money that we would make in terms of going to a bowl game towards their budget every year.
Can I ask you, I'm sorry to hijack this a little bit, but can I ask you what your reaction was? Like, I mean, because as a counselor, like your process was in terms of when everything came out about Penn State. People were saying all kinds of things about Coach Paterno, a lot of which weren't true. Right. Just accusations flying everywhere about, and these are people that you knew well. Right. And just, was that something that you needed to actually process from a counseling perspective? What was that like? Was it shocking? What was that like?
For me, it was shocking because, number one, all this transpired while I was going to Penn State, while I was actually a student and a football player there. And I never heard anything in terms of, Coach Sandusky or anything else. And actually, a couple of the events, which he did for Second Mile, which was his charitable organization, I actually went with him too and spoke at. And the thing I try to remind people is that you have to understand that, number one, when these things supposedly transpired, that Joe Paterno was 75 years old when this all transpired and happened. Number two, there were individuals and professionals in terms of child welfare services and other different professional programs run through the state that were tasked with being able to ensure the safety of these children that were in the care of Jerry Sandusky. And if these professionals who are licensed by the state could not tell or see signs of this, what do you expect a 75-year-old man to do in terms of being able to see, he had to know what was going on? How do we know? The only way you can tell if someone actually knew about something is to ask them and to see what do they know about it. And as I said, I was a student there, a football player. I heard nothing about it. The people I talked to knew nothing about it. Other fellow students, players, we had no clue. We didn't know. And the one individual who said that he had supposedly saw something, I'm trying to, in my mind's eye, think, if I'm a 22, 23-year-old man and I see something in a shower that's inappropriate between a man and a child, do I walk away from that? In my estimation, no, you don't. You can't. It's not possible. So those are my thoughts, and purely my thoughts from that perspective, because I know me as an individual. I have nieces and nephews. I have many young children in my family. If I see something going on that's inappropriate, I might need to be arrested because I'm going to do something about it, because it's a child being taken advantage of, if that is indeed what happened. So from that standpoint, for me, it's a very little difficult and a hard pill to swallow.
Thank you. Sorry if that was out of left field there, but how could I not? That's kind of my job, so I got it.
Maybe take one more question.
Yeah, just going in a completely different direction, and a question for Dave. I'm just wondering, in terms of your career writing, about sports, did you ever talk with University of Tennessee women's basketball coach Pat Summitt? She's one of my sheroes. I'm just wondering what you have to say about her.
No, I've never interviewed Pat Summitt. I did do a very, very long interview, and this actually connects with Penn State. I did a very long interview with Sally Jenkins, who, in addition to being Joe Paterno's last interview, just produced a book with Pat Summitt. And so I had a long interview with Sally Jenkins on my radio show, which if you Google, you could find it, about Coach Summitt. And I mean, Coach Summitt, is amazing. Absolutely, no question about it. And her biography is stunning. I've written several articles about her, just culled from what I could find online, and that was enough to provide content to write about. Because given the quality of her career, given the eras that she spanned, and given some of the resistance that she stood up to, and doing it all in SEC country, which is no joke, to make women's basketball happen in the 1970s in the Southeastern Conference. It's pretty amazing. And it's one of those stories that, makes you start to believe in sports as transformative. And she's a great example of this. When I was talking before about the difference between a transactional and a transformative coach, like as somebody who wasn't just thinking like, how do I get that next Final Four? But how do I actually make sure that the women in my program come out of my program in a better place than when they went in?
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to
Thank
Dave
you.
for visiting with us.
And I feel like, I'm sorry, I wanted to say this publicly before I left here, is just my absolute dearest friend growing up had a very, very rough time. He was from Teaneck, and he had a very, very rough time at Bard College and got kicked out for reasons I won't explain here. But he got his life back on track by coming to William Paterson. And I've always had a place in my heart for this place as well, because it was a place that was there for him and allowed him to be the kind of person that I always knew he could be. So I'm so honored to be here. So thank you.